And we are back on the Zero Hour. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and I always disclose my conflicts of interest on any segment or any reporting we do. My conflict of interest for the upcoming segment is that I'm extremely fond of our next guests, and I'm also working on a project with them. Stephen Swig is co-founder of the National Student Debt Jubilee Project. He is co-founder and president emeritus of Presidio Graduate School in San Francisco, a senior fellow with the Advanced Leadership Initiative at Harvard University. Mary Green Swig is co-founder also of the National Student Debt Jubilee Project. She was founder and CEO of Mary Green, an international design firm, marygreen.com, I believe, and co-author of How to Be an Importer and Pay for Your World Travel. She is also I believe, a senior fellow, yes, at the Advanced Leadership Initiative, Harvard University. They're great people, and we share a cause in common, thanks to my meeting them. Mary and Steve, thanks for joining us.
How do you do? It's great to be here.
It is.
Well, it's delightful to have you, and we're here to talk about student debt. Now, the three of us wrote a piece for the Huffington Post not too long ago called Liberate 41 Million Americans from Student Loan Debt. And the premise was a bold one that, you know an idea is good when you think to yourself, why didn't I think of that? And you guys really approached us with this idea, and I got it right away. And let's start with you, Steve. The idea in a nutshell is what?
The idea is that coming from a place where we're trying to deal with issues of the wealth gap and how the executive compensation to worker compensation has just escalated so that there's a dying and diminishing middle class and the lack of a sustainable future, we looked at and came through the genius really of Mary to the issue that would be a metaphor for the wealth gap issue, for how we're not planning for a future by taking too much capital for ourselves now, that we have, in fact, taken the community and moral responsibility of educating our younger generation and creating a sustainable future through education, that we have forsaken that responsibility and made it into an individual obligation of the student to educate himself and not to worry about the future. But we developed the project in order to take cognizance of that fact, to take and gather the community that is supposed to be taking care of the future, revitalizing it, and taking this as a metaphor for the wealth gap issue to
now,
take
just
41 million people.
And to make clear we understand what we're talking about here, the idea is, we've seen and heard a lot of proposals about reducing the interest paid on certain debts and so on. But the idea here would be just a much bolder and simpler one, to forgive all student debt. And I think, Mary, you told me some time ago that stories were a big part of this inspiration on both of your parts, and you've heard a couple of why don't you share one or two of those stories that led you to this kind of thinking about not just finessing the issue, but actually just wiping out this 1.3 trillion in student debt?
Well, there are so many stories. We were meeting with someone yesterday on this issue, and each of us had a story that was sort of fascinating. His story was a friend of his who was an attorney who was thinking about getting married to somebody who was, I guess, maybe 25 years older than she was, didn't have a lot in common, and just, he couldn't figure out why they might be getting married. And finally she said, I have all this student debt, and I'm sort of hoping that maybe this will help me with my student debt. And he went, what? You are actually taking the issue of student debt and injecting it into a relationship. That said, in the same room was someone who said, I actually have, he was 48 years old, and he said, I have paid off my student debt for 27 years, and I'm now in love with a woman who has $50,000 worth of student debt, and I don't think I can marry her because I can't take on that debt.
So
third one in the room was somebody who said that she had $150,000 worth of student debt and was about to marry a man who had $75,000 worth of student debt. Everything. It was very interesting that so much of this was around marriage, building a relationship, and trying to build a life, and that they were actually still going to do it, although they felt that they would never pay it off.
Well, it's astounding to me, number one, that these stories exist, and number two, that it seems you guys told me this when we first met and by phone, and I've found it to be true, that when you talk to people about student debt, and you can basically go into any room and say, so what do you guys think about student debt? And you'll hear stories like these, that there are 41 million Americans carrying student debt, and then there are their families, there are friends and their communities. So the ripples of this are virtually, you could say, universal. Now, Steve, one of the things you find is in bringing up an idea like forgiving all student debt, it challenges a lot of political, let's say, conventional thinking of a political and economic and social kind. That says, it'd be a moral hazard, or it would be, in some other way an undermining of the social order. But I think part of the thinking behind this idea of forgiving student debt is that far to the contrary, it reinforces longstanding American values. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, very complicated, long and wide.
Well, try to keep it brief, because it is radio, but...
The answer is yes. No, the moral responsibility of education is the moral responsibility not to allow too much debt to be incurred in the society. And a tradition that goes back over 4,000 years to ancient Sumer and incorporated on through the Bible, as we discussed in a very brilliant piece in the Huffington Post, if I do say so, last month, dealing with student debt. But the issue of taking student debt and taking the concept of forgiveness is an age-old tradition, a tradition on which the bankruptcy laws were founded, a tradition on which the usury laws were founded. Forgiveness is everywhere. And as we take on the concept of total forgiveness of student debt, a lot of people are working on free, tuition-free public college education. But that's the tomorrow, and the visionaries can focus on that. But it leaves $1.3 trillion and 41 million people and all the families affected, the members of their families affected around them, perhaps as many as 200 million people affected by this burden where society has let down its moral responsibility. Now, when we take it on as a full forgiveness, a full jubilee, what we're doing is not worrying so much about talking about the money, whether the interest rate should go down 3% or whether we get lost in the numbers, but looking at the moral responsibility that we have to forgive the debt.
Well, and I think that's a great way to put it. And Mary, we've also talked about the fact that if this is in fact a moral responsibility, then moral clarity is part of the issue. So we're not negotiating the terms of someone's indentured servitude or saying we'll make it, instead of 7 years, it'll be 6.5, or, whatever historical metaphor you want to use. We're basically saying, no, this principle is wrong. And now sometimes people say, well, this will benefit a few well-to-do folks, too. I guess my thinking about that has always been, well, if you're really well-to-do, you won't take out a student loan because you can pay for it. But what do you think about this whole moral clarity issue? Is this something that, when you talk to people about it, that you find resonates with folks?
It's interesting. It's something that often you have to sort of work people into as well. I'm thinking that in America we have this idea that everybody should pay their debts, this Calvinistic approach that everybody should pay their debts, and yet we forget sort of what that can mean. And in the actually, I'm not answering this very well, Steve. I'm going to put this one to you. Sorry.
I thought you were doing fine, just for the record.
Good from my end.
I know.
But we don't want to put you on the spot, so Steve, take it away.
So let me try to. So we've been talking with a great number of economists. Now, we're getting more and more now. Everybody seems to believe that the economic effect of removing the debt will more than pay for the resulting lack of income. Now, when we realize that 1.15 trillion of the $1.3 trillion now of debt, and looking at the spiraling, escalating amount of debt, the longer we let this problem go, the bigger it's going to get, much bigger, exponentially rising from $400 or $500 billion just in the last 3 or 4 years, more. And it's going to keep going more until we do something. In any case, the economics of it are starting to show and fall into place, and we're going to do more and more work on this. That when you look at how things are paid for and what's done, my analogy has lately been to the toll roads. And we can take a position about toll roads that only the people who use the roads should pay for them, and that therefore it relieves the tax burden, and it isn't a community responsibility. And as soon as you get on a road, you leave your driveway, you drop in a bunch of quarters into a meter at everybody's driveway, and then you ride on the roads. And you think, gee, look at all the money we're going to save the taxpayers. But then you start adding up the cumulative effect of, well, then the same amount is being paid in. It's just by selected numbers of people. And the commercial effect of that payment means that the costs of goods that are going on the public roads, for instance, just rise in equivalency to the amount of money that's being paid in the tolls by the limited number of people using, gets spread out through society. In many ways, it's like buying an insurance policy. It spreads out the risk over the entire society. The question is whether we are in this all together to provide for a sustainable future, or whether each individual student is responsible for taking the load off of the past generation, paying the past generation back with interest, and just being left to go on its merry way, owing all of this money to the past.
And to take your metaphor and loop it into the discussion here, we're talking with Stephen and Mary Green Swig about student debt and forgiving all student debt, the idea of forgiving all student debt. If, to use the toll road analogy, it's as if we're telling the young people of the nation, it seems to me, that you have to pay the toll for getting to your school and getting an education, and you may or may not get that money back. And if you don't have that money, you have to borrow and remain indebted for the rest of your life. And that seems, to mix metaphors, a little bit like a heck of a way to run a railroad.
Or a freeway, or a road system. It's as if you're paying the guys who built the road, who get an internal rate of return of something like 300%, and it works out to be one of the best economic deals, where all the money floats to the top, and the dregs are left at the bottom, by which the students have to struggle for the dregs without being given the appropriate foundation to actually go and make a meaningful future, and to have the choice that relieving the debt will give them to build their own future, instead of having to do all of the things in this form that we use those words, indentured servitude, that the master provides to force the student along a certain line and cause a very stale future to be created.
And there are all sorts of invisible costs. We don't know who doesn't, to use the toll road metaphor, who doesn't try to drive. In this case, we don't know how many people aren't able to live out their dreams or try an entrepreneurial vision or creative life for themselves because they feel they have to take the safe course and so on. So there's so much we could talk about this. Unfortunately, we're going to have to bring it to an end with one last thought. I guess, Mary, I would ask you this. You're hopeful? I mean, this seems like a bold vision. Are you hopeful, cautiously optimistic, energized, or in despair, or something else? How do you think this is going to work out? You feeling good about
hopeful.
Wildly hopeful?
Wildly hopeful. Everybody that I talk to about this, and it's a multitude of people, everybody comes around to, why don't we do this? Even my doctor this morning. It was interesting. I was at my doctor. We were talking about this very issue. We always talk about politics. And he told me about everybody in his department. He was at a major hospital. Everybody there has student debt. Everybody. And it's one of those, it's one of those sort of secrets that people whisper about, and then they get together and talk about it. And when we talk about this, the more that we talk about this, the more people sort of come our way, I guess.
Well, we're going to keep at it, and we are going to have a petition coming out. There are going to be a number of actions with Campaign for America's Future and some other organizations. So we're going to keep folks involved in this issue, informed on this issue, and I hope you guys will come back and talk to us again.
Well, that would be lovely.
Thank you.
We've been talking with Stephen Swig and Mary Green Swig, co-founders of the National Student Debt Jubilee, about the concept of forgiving all student debt. Stephen and Mary, thanks for joining us. We will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour.